On today's episode of Uncommon Sense, my colleague Lee and I take a deep dive into Pope Leo XIII's Rerum Novarum as we continue our series on Catholic social teaching. Well, hello, viewers and listeners. Welcome to another episode of Uncommon Sense, the official podcast of the Society of Gilbert Keith Chesterton. My name is Joe Grabowski. I'm VP for Evangelization, joined by Lee Sondano, my colleague. Hi, Lee.
Hey, Joe. How you doing?
Very good, thank you. And you were with us last week. We started this conversation on Rerum Novarum, and we're anxious to kind of get into it once again here. And before I turn things over to Hugh, because you're going to kind of host, I just want to remind our viewers and listeners that the only way that we're able to bring you this content is with your help and support. And the best way you can do that for us today is to like this podcast, share it, make sure you're subscribed on wherever you get your podcasts, whether it be YouTube or on a podcast app. Just help us get the word out there so that this great conversation can continue. We think that we here at the Chesterton Society have a unique perspective to bring to bear as we kind of look at the new Pope Leo in light of the former Pope Leo. And we're excited for the conversation as it develops over the next few weeks and months.
Yeah, perfect. So, as we recap, if you haven't listened to the last podcast, I think it would be good to get a historical base for what we're talking about in Rerum Novarum today. But to get people caught up, we're talking about, the late 1800s when Rerum Novarum was written. This is a time of a lot of change. We talked about it being an age of revolutions. A springtime of nations, of course, was in the mid 1800s. This was, Pope Leo XIII. We talked about at great length last time as well that he was born before the invention of photography. So this is just kind of the sort of a lot of change going on, really similar to, I think, our day and age with some of the revolution that we're seeing with technology. But this was specifically an encyclical that was written by a very prolific writer and theologian in Pope Leo XIII while he was locked up in the Vatican. This was, of course, after Vatican I. And we have, I believe it's in 1891, one of his greatest works that was written during his pontificate, and that is Rerum Novarum. And I think Rerum Novarum really deals with those issues of the moment. I mean, that's really is the kind of the defining factor of Rerum Novarum. And I think when we read some of the first paragraphs of it, I think we're going to be surprised when we're reading them, even through the lens of us here in 2025, of how relevant some of that language is. And why is that, you think, Joe? I mean, there's some specificity here, certainly, because of everything that's going on in the late 1800s and everything that's culminated from the couple of generations since the Industrial Revolution. But what's happening here during this time frame? But then what's also happening in this encyclical that brings it a lasting sort of relevance to us?
Great question. Yeah, and it's a good caution, I think, for people embedded in your question. And what I mean by that is this. There's kind of, we spoke about this a little bit, well, let's just be honest, during a failed attempt at recording this very same episode yesterday. Yep. But there's kind of two hermeneutics for how to read Rerum Novarum. Pope Leo opens with this introduction wherein he says that this is very much the issue on everybody's minds. Everybody's talking about it. The relationship between capital and labor is all over the newspapers, is what the socialists are agitating about. It's what the bishops are concerned about. So it's very timely, this encyclical. And the danger in reading it simply that way, with that hermeneutic of this is all about practical questions that were germane at the time, is that you miss the perennial principles that he's going to base his analyses on and base his prescriptions on. And so it's very important to, I think, have that other hermeneutic and look for the continuity of teaching with the principles Leo is laying forth with what came before, but also the legitimate developments that Leo is sort of engaging in that will later come to define the Catholic social tradition. So you find, at least in seed form, all the concepts that would become championed by Pope Pius XI or John Paul II, things like solidarity, subsidiarity, the preferential option for the poor, the universal destination of goods, all of these things that are now kind of the pillars of Catholic social doctrine as we understand it, are all in this encyclical. And, I don't want people to miss the trees for the forest, so to speak. They don't want to miss those pillars by looking at this simply, as a product of its time. Incidentally, let me just say, I don't think that it's always a mistake. I don't think that it's always just a hermeneutical error that people make when reading this. I think sometimes it's agenda driven, because if you can say, well, he was talking about particular conditions that only were relevant at the time of the Industrial Revolution, and these kinds of factories, maybe particularly factories in Europe or whatever, if you read it in that way, you can very easily dismiss the teachings that would maybe trouble us and maybe trouble our approach to economics if we took them a little more seriously and read them as relevant still for our times.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good reminder as well. When we're reading through this, there are some socioeconomic conditions that are mentioned as well. We're going to talk a little bit about socialists. Capitalism makes an appearance in this document, but I think it's really interesting. Just opening the opening paragraph of this. Where Pope Leo XIII says that the spirit of revolutionary change, which has long been disturbing the nations of the world, should have passed beyond the sphere of politics and made its influence felt in the cognitive sphere of practical economics, is not surprising. And I think what's so interesting about that is he's talking about this revolutionary change that's been taking place over the last couple of decades of the 1800s, but how that's really made its mark in practical economics. And I think even this day and age, just kind of bringing it back to why it's even relevant today, and why this is maybe a good exercise, is because, like I said earlier, we're seeing this in some another industrial change that's happening today with technology, and I think there's a lot of there's recent newspaper articles that are coming out about the economics of the thing, right? The economics of the machine, of AI, of these other technologies that are coming up. So when you read this in Rerum Novarum, it's just interesting that from 1891 through the lens of today, it could have almost been written today, or maybe written in a few years from today, and had that same lasting impact, especially when it comes to economics. And that's really, I think, what we're getting at here, right, with Rerum Novarum. And maybe there's more, Joe, you can enlighten us on that. But we're talking about conditions of work, conditions of labor, but that really is tying into economics as a whole, and how those things should be treated in the economic sphere, and maybe the appropriate way of treating these things in the economic sphere. Because we've got, not to jump ahead too much, but we've got, some clear voices of the right way of doing things, whether that's a socialist methodology or a capitalistic methodology. And we're kind of biting into that a little bit with Rerum Novarum, saying, there might be another way. There might be another economic way of looking at this change and looking at this revolution of change.
Yeah, well, I'll say one thing in response to that, which is, that introductory paragraph, that it's no surprise, he says, that this revolutionary change has now found its way into economics, and that indicates that there's sort of an upstream downstream relationship that is just taken for granted.
Right.
Now, I mentioned in the last episode last week that you can kind of notice, if you're paying close attention, that he makes reference to several other issues that he had written about previously. And if you go back to those, you'll find that it's on the Christian foundation of the state, on the nature of state authority and where it comes from, that it ultimately comes from God. Things like this, the nature of human liberty, that human liberty is not, libertarian type liberty or utter freedom, but it is rather being free in the truest sense of that Christ comes to make us free. And this is a big point. We're going to kind of, through the rest of this episode, go through Rerum Novarum in a close reading style and really almost paragraph by paragraph. But one of the big themes that I think just gets missed, because maybe we're just thinking, well, that's just the vocabulary because he's a pope, because of course
Sure.
he's going to be bringing religion into it. No, that's actually, I would argue, the fundamental grounding principle is that to the extent that society moves away from God, to the extent that society becomes irreligious, to the extent that the scientific revolution that precedes the Industrial Revolution, and then the social revolutions that assert a new Enlightenment-born anthropology on human affairs, to the extent that those things come in place of Christian values and Christian tradition, of course, society is going to go off the rails. That's basically Leo's premise.
Sure.
And so consistently throughout here, he calls people back to religion, and he says quite forthrightly that everything else he's proposing is moot if we don't return to religion, because without that return, none of this will work. And I think that that's something important to keep in mind. I think that those who would try to take Catholic social teaching and treat it too much as a social science or something like that and applied economics are doing precisely the thing that Leo would warn about. They're secularizing this when you really just can't. You can't divorce it from these primary concerns of, the first answer in the Baltimore Catechism. Who is God, and why did God make me?
Sure. So let's take a step back then. Let's look at paragraph 1. So what are we laying out here? What are the elements of the conflict now raging that's being talked about right at the very start? So let's set up kind of the groundwork here for Rerum Novarum, just right in paragraph 1.
Yeah, and this is significant too. Again, if you have the right hermeneutical hat on, you're gonna notice something here. So he talks about the vast expansion of industrial pursuits and the discoveries of science. Right, two things: the scientific age and industrialism. The changed relationship between masters and workmen. Right, so no longer tenant farmers and things like that, but now the factory or the industrial wage system. The enormous fortunes of some individuals, the utter poverty of the masses. So, again, this should sound familiar to our contemporary discourse, right? So the disparity of wealth throughout society. He says the increased self-reliance and closer mutual combination of the working classes. So the new phenomena of labor unions and workers' associations that are kind of taking the place of the medieval guilds or the old guild system. And then finally, he caps it with the elements now raging, the prevailing moral degeneracy. And I just want to note in all of that, he doesn't mention the socialists once, right? These are the elements of the conflict now raging. The socialists are going to be in response to this. And of course, he will have things to say, strong things to say about the socialists. But laying out the problem right here, he's described a situation that I think if you approach it again with the right hermeneutic, you're not going to miss the applicability to our times. And you're not going to get out of it as easily as, trying to give a summary of this document to say that, well, it condemns socialism, because once again, it's much more rich than that.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting point, because I think we tend to a lot of times look at the prescription to the problem, whether that's socialism or capitalism or some other form of practical economics that we're looking at, and instead of looking at the issues that would bring about that prescription, right? And that's kind of what we're saying here, is that when we're looking at true Catholic social teaching, it's not just a matter of looking at a type of a way of being, whether that's socialist or capitalist or whatnot, but it's really looking at what's setting up the groundwork for this, what's setting up the framework for this, and then we're coming up with a response. So the response isn't to other responses; the response is to the problem, which I think is really important in Rerum Novarum as well, because it's going to the root of the thing. Again, not just a response to a response, right?
Yes, and we'll move through this more quickly, but there's another thing that he does right, in paragraph 2 that I think is important. As he starts to make this response, he says he admits the peril, let's say, of this very conversation. And once again, speaking as somebody who has gone out and tried to share distributism, share Catholic social teaching in mixed audiences and things, I think that the same danger applies today. He says it's not an easy discussion. It's not easy to define the relative rights and mutual duties of the rich and the poor, of capital and labor. And then there is this danger that crafty agitators are intent on making use of these differences to pervert men's judgments and to stir up the people to revolt. Now we get to the communists, we get to the socialists. These are the crafty agitators, and so they're this notion though that the church, because of the way he's going to analyze this problem, this is again the important point that you miss if you read that too fast. The danger lies in this, that these crafty agitators will do this. I think he's sort of acknowledging that they can do this because the church is going to come in with a very nuanced take on this. The church is going to come in and say, yeah, there's a big problem. There's a big problem in the disparity of wealth. There's a big problem in the working conditions of the poor. There's a big problem in the amassing of capital into the hands of a few within nations who then get to basically run the entire system and game it for themselves, right?
Right.
So whether you call it crony capitalism or whatever, but once again, it's precisely because he's going to be coming in with that hard critique that he already has to acknowledge right up front that the socialists are probably going to have a heyday with this.
Sure.
And so he also needs to get out of the way right up front. No, I'm not speaking your language, even though it might ring a bell.
Right. So then we're moving on to paragraph 3 here, where Pope Leo XIII is talking about the misery of the working class, and he talks about why that is, and he actually gives some specific levels of why, and he does lay some blame. So what is it that he's blaming here for the misery of this working class that he's seeing?
Several things. He says the abandonment of the guilds system that I mentioned, and we'll get to that later, kind of what distinguishes guilds from, say, modern labor unions. Irreligion, as I mentioned before, comes up already now. The irreligion, especially in the law, that lawmakers are not guided by religion in making statutes. Unchecked competition, usury. He brings up the concentration of power by the division of labor in this new economic system. So this is sort of, again, a reiteration almost of paragraph 1, but now he's putting a little more meat on the bones with, certain industries, the lending industry, for example, the labor unions and the way that labor is organizing.
Sure. Yeah. And then so he's kind of taking aim at these labor unions a little bit, talking about the misery of the working class. And then in the next 2 paragraphs, he's actually taking aim a little bit more specifically and explicitly on socialism. And he explains a little bit about how socialists would harm workers, right? But by denying him the one way out of the current paradigm, which is saving and investing. So, he takes a couple of paragraphs to describe that, but what is the meat of this, and what is he getting to in these paragraphs of talking to specifically why socialism would harm workers?
Well, because it denies the right of private property, he sees that the only way, especially peaceful way out of a kind of wage system, or out of the sort of state of reliance, which he calls in another place in the encyclical "little better than slavery," that wage earners have. If they don't have any right to private property, they're never going to get out of this, right?
Sure.
And so. He also, though, says that it will distort the functions of the state. If the state comes in and takes from the lawful possessors of property, that property, to try to redistribute it or try to hold it in common on behalf of people, that's clearly rife with problems, and it's going to lead to corruption and things like that. So that's part of it. The other thing, though, that he goes on, and it connects to the labor union issue, is what he calls creating utter confusion in the community. And this is sort of...
It's a great way to put it, though, right? I mean, I think he ends paragraph 4 with that, this distort the functions of the state and create utter confusion in the community.
Yeah, and confusion really, here he's anticipating what kind of waits to get articulated, because it's you have to wait now almost, well, literally a century till John Paul II, until you get a good philosophical, practicalities aside and material conditions aside, a good philosophical critique of what really makes Marxism so poisonous at the root. And it's the material dialectic. We don't need to get into all of that. We won't talk about Hegel and so forth. But basically the premise that class wars against class, that's the nature of human affairs, that it's always conflict that moves society forward. That's the only way that history advances, right? He's sort of alluding to this here, because he knows that that's precisely the way that they're kind of speaking about the way out of this. And he knows that some of these new labor movements are being organized precisely with that mentality, with that ideology in mind. And then, of course, the ownership class is responding in kind. They're now going to see labor as the enemy because it's, maybe doing violent activity or uprisings or whatever. And this is the disaster that's going to come about if sanity doesn't prevail. And so it's a really important point to bear in mind. He's going to propose instead, I am anticipating here, but he's going to propose instead something more like the medieval guilds where trades from master to apprentice were in harmony and worked together, and they saw themselves as part of a community working for the common weal and also for one another's mutual good. And that's, so it sounds a little pie in the sky, but ideally he wants to see unions that are labor and ownership together,
Sure.
not just workers unions, against labor, because
Right.
that, he says, participates sort of in the socialist lie.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people would hear that, and they would think that maybe that's a slowing down of progress a little bit, especially when you're looking back at something that maybe was cauterized during medieval time frame. But I think we're seeing the exact opposite, and we're seeing a lot of this happen even this day and age, where there is a movement back to the land, and not to jump too far ahead, but to private ownership as well, and private
Mm-hmm.
property. And what's really interesting is from the explanations that he's done of kind of laying the groundwork here. He's taken a couple of jabs specifically at what's causing these issues in the working class, how socialism specifically would also harm workers. And then he goes brilliantly into laying out the groundwork for what the natural law argument is for private property. And he takes a little while doing that. So maybe describe that to us. He takes several paragraphs, I believe, talking through what the natural law argument is for private property and why it's a necessity.
Yeah, and it is sort of novel too. I mean, you can find it in Aquinas, I think, but the real idea basically is just that a man works more diligently and is more productive with something that he can kind of claim as his own. So that's part of it. Also, just the part of it that, based on human nature, because humans, rational animals, can take stock for the future, can plan for the future, there's sort of this implication in there. And he also argues from the Bible. He says, this is sort of what it means to dominate and cultivate the way that Adam is commanded to do in the garden. And so, because man is the only creature, fleshly creature, let's say, they can take stock for the future, it therefore becomes right for him to not only have for now, but have for the future, and to lay down somewhat for the future. And ultimately, in a certain sense, this is sort of is itself kind of a preamble of religiosity as an activity, because the way that you're preparing for your own material future sort of becomes a lesson, an object lesson for, like, what Christ tells us to do, which is to lay up treasure in heaven, right? So it's a very important point that he makes, drawing this out. And I think, too, just the practicality argument that he makes, that, things, if you think of what cultivation is, if you think about, for example, I have a friend who's currently working on hybridizing tobacco plants in order to take a wild tobacco that grows in his area. These are actually the guys from the Chesterton and Co. cigar store out in Steubenville, Ohio,
Gotcha.
near Franciscan. And one of the guys is trying to hybridize tobacco. There's a wild tobacco that he has, a cultivar, that grows there, but it's very unpleasant. It's not pleasant to smoke. So he's trying to blend it with Connecticut tobacco so that it becomes a more gentle and a more kind of palatable smoke. But it takes at least 7 years in order to do this crossbreeding of these two types of plants. You're not going to achieve that without private property. You're not, if he doesn't have ownership over the plants and over the land where he can do this, you're never going to get there. And so that's kind of the basis of the argument that Leo makes in the next several paragraphs, kind of leading up to, I guess, paragraph 15 or so.
Yeah. So is he laying up the idea of just to dissect that a little bit further? Is he laying up the idea of private property because it's directly correlated to production? So that's really what we're looking at, is private property equals production, which then equals kind of this, I guess, third way or middle way that we're going to get into in a little bit later. But is that kind of the argument he's making, is you can't have one without the other?
Sort of, yes. I would say rather, well, yes, and but I think more what the upshot of that is that it's specifying that this is the kind of property that he's going to talk about as
Mm,
sacred and inviolable. It is productive property.
sure.
So it's not necessarily he's not necessarily claiming, that it's impossible to achieve production out of collected property, but even that you would have to voluntarily do it in a small community, kind of like maybe monks do or whatever. So there is, at least theoretically, the possibility to achieve production out of this. But what he's saying is, for the good of society, this particular kind of property needs to be held as inviolable, productive property. So, as I said on the last episode last week, we're not talking about an Adirondack chair on your porch. We're not talking about, your kitchen, well, maybe your kitchen gadgets, but we're not talking about stuff that you own and use for no productive end.
Sure.
He's specifically talking about that because eventually he's going to come to, what about other kind of property, the use of property, the use of, and then he goes back to the ancient tradition. If you have two cloaks in your closet and the poor man has none, one of those cloaks belongs to the poor man. So
Hmm.
there's a very important distinction to be made here, right? Between, it's not just private property, writ large, of all kinds of property. The sacred and inviolable nature of property is, the productive end, the capital side.
Sure. Yeah. And I think he lays that out a little bit too, because if we're jumping now ahead to, we've laid this groundwork of what it means for ownership and for private property. And then in paragraph 13 is where he talks a little bit about subsidiarity. Right. And so this kind of is, we're gradually moving on to this kind of brilliant laying of the groundwork of what this means for natural law and for private ownership of property. But as you put it, Joe, it isn't just private property for the sake of having property, but it's not for the sake of your Adirondack chair. It's for the sake of production. And that's where subsidiarity comes in. So maybe describe that a little bit, where we get to paragraph 13, where he's articulating subsidiarity.
Yeah, he says, if, society naturally grows out of families entering into relationship with one another. And he says, if a family were then to experience hindrance in a commonwealth instead of help, finding their rights attacked rather than upheld, such as their rights to property, society would become an object of detestation rather than of desire. And so this is really subsidiarity, which will become maybe more clearly articulated by Pius XI, but it's already here in kernel form. And it's also really fascinating that, again, the locus is families, and that's another consistency
Sure.
throughout the Catholic social teaching, is that we're not talking about the atomized individual, we're talking about families. But also implicit in that definition of subsidiarity that he makes, any commonwealth that acts this way would be also shooting itself in the foot, right?
Hmm.
Because, and this is where the Marxists have it wrong in Leo's analysis, because of everything that he's laid out about how wealth is best generated, or what leads to the best generation of wealth. And I don't think you can deny this if you just look at the fates of Western economies versus those that labored under Sovietism for nigh 100 years. We've raised so many people out of poverty, out of absolute poverty, or subsistence level living. So there definitely is truth to this, that private property is going to lead to a betterment of society. So if the society says to you, you can't have private property because we're trying to improve the society, it's taking away from you not only the very tool that you use to better your own state, but the very tool that you would use to benefit society most. And therefore, once again, once it's collectivized, now you're just going to suborn people to a kind of slavery on the land and say, here, now farm. And we have countless examples in the 20th century of why that goes very disastrously wrong.
Sure. Yeah. And I mean, there's a lot that we can unpack there as well, even for modern times when you talk about private property. I'm sure a lot of listeners, or could there be a few listeners that are listening to this thinking that, what's the practicality of private ownership of property? And maybe we should define that a little bit as well. I don't think we're all talking about, that we own, as great as this would be, Joe, especially for you over there in Pennsylvania, just owning 20 acres and a ton of land. But is that what we're talking about here when we say private property? Are we saying an amount of land that makes you, I guess, productive enough for something beyond your family? Or let's kind of let's zero in on that a little bit. What are we talking about when we say private property? Because I want to make sure we're clear on some of the implications, so that we're not necessarily all running for the hills. Although that might be a nice thing too, but
Yeah.
it'd be interesting to talk through that. Yeah,
Well, this is where the rubber meets the road, and this is also where legitimate debate will enter in.
yeah,
Where productive property, uh, you know, is where the delineation is, right? Because you could argue that certain forms of just mere intellectual property are a kind of productive property, certainly, um, but it's not therefore unjust to have sunsetting laws on, you know, what intellectual property or what kind of copyright you can hold, for example,
sure.
or what kind of patent you can enforce, for example. So these things will get cashed out in policy, I think, both by Leo, policy prescriptions or suggestions by Leo and by future popes. But the fundamental thing is property from which you can generate further wealth and plan adequately, for your future, so that you're not completely reliant upon a mere contractual obligation of another for your own future subsistence, right? So,
Sure.
like, simply being a wage slave, right,
Yeah.
is kind of what he's getting at. You need at least some property to secure you against that.
Right. And we get into that a little bit with paragraph 15, right? About why some of those things wouldn't be a good idea. And he goes into some specifics. The door would be thrown open for envy, invectiveness, discord, sources of wealth themselves would run dry. No one would have any interest in exerting his talents or his industry. So, I mean, he goes on and on about what would cause some of these things. And really it's
Mhm.
because of, you're subjugating your citizens to a form of slavery. And that's really what would cause a lot of these issues, and which is why he's pretty explicit in paragraph 15 about private property being key.
Yeah, and once again, that critique that he's making there, that if you deny this right, ideologically or in practice, it's going to lead to the same ends, right? It's going to lead to that envy. It's going to lead to people not wanting to work because they don't have any stake in it. They don't have any interest in it. It doesn't call upon their creativity. It doesn't improve their own personal future. That is going to be equally true of kulaks working on a collective farm in the Soviet Union, as it will be for factory workers, a la Charlie Chaplin in modern times, simply swinging a wrench on a conveyor belt, right?
Right.
These are the two extremes, but they kind of lead to the same end. It comes full circle. Both of these are ways of denying private property. So you're either denying it as a matter of principle and as a matter of law, which the socialists would have us do, or you're denying it for all intents and purposes by the practical arrangement of the economy, as the economy that Leo is critiquing at the time
Sure.
did, and arguably, uh, future iterations of the same mode of economy have struggled to get that balance right.
Right. So we've been taking a look, at really setting this thing up. A lot of definition is taking place here. Leo XIII is taking a lot of time going through what isn't right, and right at the end of paragraph 15, all of this is sort of culminating together, where he says, this being established, everything that we've talked about thus far, he's going to proceed to show where the remedy sought for must be found. So he's even admitting at this point, we've outlined all of these things that are problematic. We do admit that there must be a solution. And I think paragraph 16, that's what makes it so powerful, is he's presenting a very important assumption of a solution. So maybe walk us through that, Joe. I mean, this is very unique, by the way. I mean, we've talked about socialism earlier on in these paragraphs, but this is really, at this point in time, and I'll let you get to what his point is in paragraph 16. But has this ever been presented before as an important assumption of a remedy? Or is this maybe one of the first times that we've seen this in some sort of encyclical or writing from the church?
Well, so he he says no practical solution of this question will be found apart from the intervention of religion and of the church.
Full stop.
Yeah. He's calling us. He says, we affirm without hesitation that all the striving of men will be in vain if they leave out the church. Now, again, this could take us in mercurial variety of directions here, because we could talk about integralism. We could talk about the debates between the modern kind of schools of thought on these things. But I think that no, this isn't a new thing with Leo. I think that it is there in the tradition. I think you're going to find it in the writings of people like Thomas Aquinas, Robert Bellarmine, Alphonsus Liguori, folks like that. You're also going to find kind of already, if you look at kind of England and the beginnings of apologetics movements that will birth Chesterton and Belloc and things like that, writers like that, you're
Sure.
already getting the argument made that Christianity has done this. It has a proven track record.
Right.
It's what destroyed slavery and abolished actual slavery. It is what brought about, better relations in marriage, and especially respect for women, and having them, not be treated essentially as second-class citizens by their own husbands, widows having rights and protections, care for orphans, things like this. Christianity has done this in the past. It has confronted civilization, and with simply by pursuing the values that the gospel proposes, has brought about material and practical cures for the ills of society. And so that's what Leo is really basing this on. And he does make that explicit at one point later in the encyclical, or he makes that kind of argument explicit that, like, look, if you don't believe us, if you think that this is just, some kind of utopian madness,
Right.
go ahead and look at the history, figure it out.
And this is, and it's in direct contrast to very, very secular modes, right? And that's what we've been seeing and leading up to. And I think that's an important distinction as well. Not that this is new for the church, like you pointed out. There's a lot of writers and even the church fathers that would talk about this, but this is a point in time where it was necessary to outline these secular modes that were coming into play, and an alternative to those, and being very explicit about the solution cannot be found apart from the church. But like you just said, in no way is he saying that this is utopic or ideal in nature, right? And he even admits that in later paragraphs as well.
Yeah, and you could also say that John Adams and Ben Franklin had, in a certain nascent way, admitted this, right? The founding fathers of America admitted that so much of the experiment that they were setting up, this new experiment in liberty, would rely upon the values of Christian men in order to sustain it, right?
Right. There's a large assumption there, right? And they make that clear at the beginning. Yeah.
Exactly. And so this is, again, nothing new. It will be later. I just looked ahead. It's later in paragraphs 27 and 28, if you want to kind of footnote from where we are here in paragraph 16 and this radical plea that he's making about religion. It's 27 and 28 where he'll make sort of the historical argument that he uses the word renovate. The church can effectively renovate society. And therefore he says, the church, even though, yes, the church is concerned with spiritual things, in no wise should the church be excluded from these discussions, because the church's impact on society has always been positive, has led to greater prosperity, has led to greater health, has led to more peaceful relations between peoples. And again, if you want to find a modern version of that argument, first of all, it's now kind of a standard in apologetics, but you could also find it in people that aren't necessarily even believers themselves. Tom Holland, the historian, in his great book Dominion, kind of, follows this line of thought, that Western, the civilization that eventually, comes up with penicillin and cures polio and goes to the moon is a civilization built on Christianity
Yeah.
and nothing else.
Yeah, and so we've got paragraph 16 that talks about, the whatever the proposed solution is, it can't not be rooted in Christianity. That's first and foremost. But then in 17 through 20, he is admitting specifically that, he's not admitting, I guess, to any utopic or idealistic sort of expectation for a society built on Christianity, because he admits that there will always be inequality. So maybe unpack that a little bit as well. I think a lot of people this day and age, especially in maybe the late 1800s, with everything they'd gone through, are looking for a solution. And here in paragraph 17 through 20, he's even admitting that yes, Christianity is a solution, and the church is a solution, but it's not a solution to inequality. And maybe unpack that a little bit for us.
Well, so it's not a solution to inequality because everyone in the church will have, or rather, everyone in a justly ordered society will have different roles to play, and this is there's automatically just by nature different inequalities, whether you speak of different ways that people are born without certain capabilities, or whether you speak simply about the power and strength that a father has over his children and things like this. However, it's the class warfare thing that I think he's saying. So,
Yeah.
this isn't utopian, and he's also very interestingly saying that like this isn't the only tenable, pragmatic solution, right, or practicable solution. If it depends on what you mean by solution, like slavery is a stable system, right? So so the socialists could win and suborn us all to slavery and achieve long periods of stability. And if you don't care about the body count, and if you don't care about, some people dying off because of social Darwinism, and that's now human beings are just surviving by survival of the fittest. Yeah, that'll work. That'll work for you for a time. So really, he's very, very careful. I would say basically from paragraph 17 all the way up through the one that I jumped ahead to like 27. He's sort of trying to point out, no, this isn't a utopian vision. Yes, it's a harder or it's a higher way. It's calling, but it needs virtue again. So when he says apart from religion, I think you have to kind of read between the lines there. He's also really, in a practical way, saying apart from grace, because it's going to be grace. And if you just think about the Gospels, you have the same things going on. You have people defrauding others of wages. You have the unforgiving servant whose master forgives him his debts, and then he hands his own debtors over to the torturers until they pay it back and whatnot. Like you have these parables that make clear, yeah, this has always happened. So what's the difference? The difference is the justice that the gospel demands, and the justice that is only really ultimately able to be lived up to by grace.
Yeah, no, and that's a great segue to the next couple of chapters. So chapter 17 through 20, of course, he's talking a little bit again about the narrative of the socialists, and he's pretty specific about that. But in 21 through 26, paragraphs 21 through 26, to your point, he's saying that the church doesn't merely want to fix the crisis. The church has a higher call and maybe a more radical call than just fixing the crisis. And again, it goes to the Christian ethic, right?
Yeah. Well, he's explicit about it there, that the end of this crisis is is going to be both achieved by, and also if it has any point, it's leading toward ownership and labor ultimately being united in a kind of mutual friendship, he says. And he even then says a kind of brotherly love, a fraternal affection. So, and once again, I think that this is so cool because he's putting it now in gospel terms, right? And he's sort of, he would know that, communists, people making communist type experiments, they're out there, these communes, and some of them already are based on free love. I can't remember the name of the one that was up in New England. Hawthorne, I think, wrote about it at one point, but Orestes Bronson maybe lived there for a little while. You know what I'm talking about. But anyway, there's already like free love communes based on communal ownership and things like that. So he's taking this category, he's taking this language, just as the Bolsheviks will come to call one another comrade. He recognizes that kind of fraternity is important, but he's gonna raise it up to a new level, and the level of fraternal love that the gospel calls for isn't based on equality. It's about taking the lowest place. It's about being servant to one another. And the first shall be last and the last shall be first. And so he, after like kind of proposing that defeater to socialism, and says, no, we have the real fraternity. We have the real comradeship and brotherhood of workers here in the church. He then also, casually reminds that the rich, what's their incentive? So obviously the poor have an incentive, which the socialists are offering them. They want to belong. They want to have fraternity. They want to have union, and get out of their state. What's the incentive for the rich? He makes it very clear. They must tremble at the threatenings of Jesus Christ. Yeah. And this is another thing that I think sometimes when we take this and fast forward it into later 20th century discourse, it just doesn't get brought up as often. But I think it's worth our friend Chris Chuck from Catholic Answers. I heard him say it a couple of times. He said, because there's this old canard in liberal biblical scholarship that the camel in the eye of the needle is actually a small door in this big door when you open the big door, but you could fit a camel through the small door. It might have to crouch a little bit to get through. And as Chris likes to say, it's a real camel, it's a real needle, and it's really, really hard. And whether or not it is that image or whatever, I just don't think you can get around it. No matter, there's so many calls in the gospel. The rich young man goes away sad. Like we can't, precisely because we love our brothers and sisters, we cannot neglect to remind them of these stern warnings of Christ. And so there's the incentive for the rich, for ownership, to get on board with this program. They need to save their souls.
Yeah, well, and I think that's an interesting lens, these couple of paragraphs where we're talking about, the church has a higher call and a more radical call, to read some of those earlier paragraphs where we're talking about private property and private ownership, because I think there is a tendency to think that the answer then is all about private property, all about private ownership, but we're calling to something even greater. And like you said, it's the least of these, and the last shall be first. And so there's a point where private ownership could even make it, very. You've then become the camel that's going through the eye of the needle, right? And there's an opportunity here to always read, even the I guess the beginning parts of Rerum Novarum, where he's outlining some of the issues through this lens of the Christian ethic. And you can't really separate the two, right? And I think that's just a really powerful thing in these next couple chapters here.
Absolutely. And I think, this also too kind of now forms this hinge, because I really think he builds up to this part of the encyclical, kind of laying out the big principles, sort of some of the fundamentals. Again, he has spoken about, and we did pass over some of them, but his natural law argument that we talked about for private property back around, paragraph 12, 10 to 12 or so, he sort of lays out he at least mentions the universal destination of goods, saying that it's not opposed to private property. Right. He talks about the subsidiary principle, as we've already noted. He's also talked about how, justice is demanded for one another. And so, we have to have what's called commutative justice in this relationship of fraternal love. So owners and labor both owe one another something. And if a workman's wages are adequate, and if the workman's conditions are well taken care for, at that point, he's truly obligated to his employer. So he's also not kind of setting up this sort of, he doesn't want to fall into that trap either.
Sure.
So he's laid out all these principles, and now, kind of in the latter half of this encyclical, and I think we'll probably break this now into 2 episodes of a deep
Yeah.
dive discussion. In the latter half of this encyclical is where he is going to kind of go through now, piece by piece, in the society, how this cashes out in even more practical terms. What's your
Sure.
job? What's your job? What's your job?
What,
What's the state's
lay out
job?
the roles. Yep.
What does labor do? What does ownership do?
Yep.
What do priests and religious leaders do? How does the laity have its role? So he's going to
Sure.
kind of, in a systematic way, lay that out.
Yeah, and I think maybe before we close this podcast, it would be good to we jumped ahead a little bit to paragraph 27 and 28, but this really is where Pope Leo is going through, how the church has effectively renovated society, and talks through it in chapters 27 and 28. It's really interesting stuff that he goes through, because I think a lot of times we're thinking of the church as kind of this. I think some of our listeners could resonate with this of this medieval relic that then our capitalistic society was able to come in and make kind of the better parts of our society, just because of the paradigm that it was moving toward, and from medieval society. But really, here's a defense of the church being very productive, and especially among the poor, maybe among other different type of pagan cultures and things like that. Maybe talk us through that a little bit, Joe. In paragraphs 27 through 28 is what we're referencing of how the church has really cared for the spiritual concerns of people, and through that lens of the spiritual concern is how it has lifted up society.
Yeah, I think it is precisely because, once again, you could come up with stable ways of kind of running things.
Hmm.
You could theoretically come up with an efficient way of raising all the children by taking them away from their parents and things like that. But there's 2 dimensions, I would say, that he's sort of, at least implicitly, laying out here. One is that, and this is important to remember with respect to how, for lack of a better term, how the Catholic left would sometimes take these teachings in the future, because sometimes you get so caught up on the material betterment of the poor, you get so caught up on what justice demands for for these things, that you forget that the end of justice is peace, and the end of justice, which is a virtue, or the perfection of justice, which is a virtue, is caritas, the charity, love that
Right.
alone remains. And so I think it's really important to remember too that there's a bigger why for
Hmm.
this. And so he even talks to the later, he'll talk to the labor and say, your condition of poverty uh, can also be redemptive, if you begin to try to approach it in that way. Not to say that we're not going to try to fix things, but this is a really important thing that the church does. The
Sure.
church comes in, and while, yes, we try to change the material conditions, first and foremost, we see that there's a bigger goal. And so even though it might be efficient to raise all the kids in a communal classroom, away from their parents, having the state in charge of the thing, and they're taken away and educated by a state indoctrination system, that's not good, because it's not calling upon the family to exercise the unique and special virtues that a family alone has.
Right.
So I think that's a really important part of the critique that he's making. And then
Yeah.
I think we should, before closing, also just talk about those next couple paragraphs, because I think that this sort of wraps it up well, and
Sure.
connects us back to this hermeneutic discussion a little bit too.
Great. So you're talking paragraphs 29 through 31, I think, before we get into these specific roles that we'll tackle in the next episode here. But this is where we're really talking through the church's special care for the poor.
Yeah, and really maybe 29 through 30, I think it is, because he sort of starts to then segue by saying that, the church's care for the poor, or all schemes of charity such as such as that, can never really be replaced by a nanny state system. You
Right.
can't just have state programs to do this. And again, not necessarily just because it wouldn't be effective or efficient, which it probably wouldn't, almost certainly wouldn't, and it would be rife with corruption, but also because it's it's robbing Christians of a duty that they have. But this is the important part. He continuing on from this historical argument. Look, the church has done this, so don't say like, you're pie in the sky, blah blah blah. In almost every epoch of age in which the church has been a force in society, we have done this. We have changed society for the better. So we have a good track record on that, and we also lead others. But talk about a hermeneutic and how to read something from the past and how do we approach it. He goes back to the very beginning and he says, the church's special care, their special relationship, their special advantage, preferential option, you might say, for the poor was something that even aroused the pagans' admiration. Right. And then also eventually their jealousy and their hatred, right? But in some notable cases, like the famous letter, and forgive me, I don't know. I think it was letter of. I'm not going to think of the apparatchik's name who wrote the letter, but he said, "One thing I have to say for these Christians: they love one another." Pagan culture was astonished by this. Pagan culture. You can read Chesterton's Everlasting Man. They were astounded. What do you mean you don't just leave? Expose infants on the roadside if they're ill. What do you mean you care about, the less fortunate and the poor and so on and so forth? What do you mean? I mean, look at St. Paul talking to Philemon about Onesimus, right? Like, what do you mean, you love the slave in your household? Things like this. The church has always been making itself remarkable, making itself notorious. He says it aroused among the pagans admiration, and admiratio, is sort of a very interesting word. We won't go into it too much, but it can also connote almost a kind of scandal. Like, sure, just that's what admiration is. You're just shocked by this thing. Right. How do we live up to that today? I think. And that's another one of the key things that I think we'll want to talk about through this series is just, is the church living up to her own mission, her own role, if and when she ever backs away from this? And can we afford to accommodate the age? Can we afford, we as Christians who have, I'm not necessarily trying to critique the magisterium here, I'm not, but we as Christians in the workplace, what distinguishes us? What makes us different from the person next to us in line at the bank? And is it noteworthy enough that it calls their admiration and shock forth? Yeah, that's a challenging call, but that's I think that we should be living up to that standard.
Right. And I think one thing that you maybe zeroed in on through this talk is maybe that separation from efficiency, because I think that's really where people look at the church and at Christians and even at charity and think that is a little scandalous, taking the time to, when you are walking down the street, you are noticing the beggar on the side of the road where a lot of people wouldn't. And I think for many people, that is sort of a scandalous mentality. So maybe we can touch on that on the next episode as well. I know we're going to be talking through some of these roles specifically that were given by Pope Leo XIII and talking through the rest of Rerum Novarum. I'm also really excited to take what we're reading here as kind of a fine-tuned reading of each paragraph. And then maybe talk about how it's applicable but how it's even applicable today. Maybe wrap this back into Pope Leo XIV and how this might be used for society today and for the church today. So really excited to continue these conversations. So just a reminder for anyone who hasn't subscribed to these podcasts, make sure you do, because these next couple are going to be really exciting as we continue our progress through Rerum Novarum, through Pope Leo XIII, Pope Leo XIV, and what that means for our society today.
Amen. And, it's something I think that we need to return to. And if for those in the audience that maybe aren't jazzed about this, who think, aren't you kind of beating a dead horse here? Aren't you belaboring a point here? I would simply say some things bear repeating, and especially neglected things bear repeating. And Chesterton himself said that it's a secret written in the deepest books of life and the mystery of the universe, something like that. I'm paraphrasing, from the beginning of the Napoleon of Notting Hill, that you can look at something 999 times and be perfectly safe, but if you look at it the 1,000th time, you're in terrible danger of seeing it for the first time.
Hmm.
And I think that things like this that maybe we've grown accustomed to, or maybe we think we know, always bear revisiting, because not only should it be shaping us intellectually, should it be maybe guiding us morally, but in the most in the most important way, I think that it should maybe touch our heart and just call us to renewed appreciation for what we've been given, and love for God, who has loved us so much that He gives us. He doesn't just give us the big things and the creation and the church and things like that, but He can reach right down into the conditions of a guy working in a coal mine in the 19th century,
Yeah.
and say, brother, I got you. And there's no dark hole literally in which God can't reach us and find us, and we should be grateful for that.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, that's a great note to end on. Joe, again, appreciate you walking through this deep dive in the first half here of Rerum Novarum, looking to the next as well. If you're interested in reading along or looking at Rerum Novarum, of course, the Vatican website has this available for free, so you're more than welcome to look it up as we continue through our paragraph by paragraph journey through Rerum Novarum. And again, please make sure that you're subscribing to the podcast so that you can continue on this journey with us. But Joe, thank you again for your time, and looking forward to the next one.